Hey, this is Brian from Tokyo Rocket Style. Today I woke up with a message from a friend who sent me a link to a photographer she thought I might like. I checked out the photographer. They do portraiture on the streets of Milan, Italy, and it was really powerful imagery. I really liked it a lot. Thanks for that recommendation. And what made this photography really special was that the images were really impactful because the subject's face filled the frame and the viewer could see lots of details in the face and the catchlights in the eyes and the sparkle of the spirit in the photos. And I thought to myself, wow, these are really amazing images. And I wondered how the photographer achieved such intimate photos. And I guessed from having done this for many years that the photographer either had to be quite close to the subject and maybe in their personal space, or they had to be further away and using a zoom or a portraiture kind of lens. And recognizing, from having done this, I always use a 50mm lens. I guess that the photographer probably used an 80mm lens. I've long wanted to use an 80mm lens, which is considered the standard portraiture lens, but the ones that have the very big apertures, which are great for portraiture, tend to be quite prohibitively expensive, which is why I've never had one. And I've always used the 50mm lens, which they say is sort of the equivalent to the human eye. It gives you the same focal length of the human eye, and it's a little bit more forgiving because you can shoot beyond the edges of the image and you can crop, and an 80mm lens gives you a little bit more compression and it's a little bit less forgiving. And but the compromise is that you get a little bit more creativity and impact for it. So I've been thinking about, maybe it's time to level up to an 80mm lens. And that led me to think, there's 80mm, there's 35mm, there's 50mm, there's 35mm film, there's 35mm cameras, and I realized that there are these numbers that get a little bit confusing in photography. They should be really intuitive, but even for me, they get confusing. And so I thought I would make a little public service announcement and just clarify a few of these numbers and help you feel more confident in your photography. So starting with a 35mm roll of film. Now, if you grew up in a certain era or you're, coming of age in this one, then you might know of the 35mm roll of film. So this is the standard film that we grew up with film cameras. There's also medium format, 6x6, and there's 4x5, and there's 8x10, and there's medium format, large format, but this is the one that we all kind of grew up with. And I'm not gonna pull the whole thing out because I still wanna use this film, but you'll see that there's the sprockets on the top and bottom, and one photo frame sits inside the walls of these sprockets. The image doesn't go to the edge of the sprockets, it just sits inside this little frame. And so this is the first part that gets confusing is that a 35mm roll of film often has 36 images on it. And then some of them have 24 images on it. And then the other part that's confusing is that the image, one frame is 36mm by 24mm. So you have 24mm by 36mm on a film canister that has 36 photos. So where does the 35 come from? Well, the 35 is actually the distance between the top sprocket and the bottom sprocket. The thickness of the film, that is the 35mm. So the frame this way is 36, this is 34, but the distance from the top of the film to the bottom of the film is 35mm. And maybe you've heard of like 70mm film. It's like what the Tarantino movies are shot with. Imagine that is that's twice the height of the film. And the bigger the film, the more detail you can capture, the more information that you can capture. But that's the first level of confusion. Then you have the 35mm camera. Now, why is it called the 35mm camera? Is it called the 35mm camera because it has a 35mm lens on it? No, it's called the 35mm camera because it takes 35mm rolls of film. You can have a 50mm lens, you can have a 35mm lens, you can have 100mm, you can have a 1000mm lens, but it's called the 35 millimeter camera because it takes 35 millimeter rolls of film. That's where the 35 millimeter comes from. The other number that we're talking about, the other millimeter number that we're talking about is focal length. Focal length is what signifies the length of the lens. And let me give you a little bit more clarity on that. Now, every camera will have a line that you probably have never noticed on it before. And that is this little line right here. You can just barely see it. There's a little line, and that line is meant to represent the film plane. That's meant to represent where the film is going across, the film plane. So if you can imagine the film inside here, like this, the film is on the back line of this camera. It's resting here at the back of the camera, something like that. I'm showing you my name and email address, no problem there. And that line corresponds to this line. And a focal length is the distance between the back of the lens, the back piece of glass of the lens, the back glass, and the line here. That distance is, in this case, 50 millimeters. The back of this lens to this little line here, the film plane, that distance is 50 millimeters. So that's where the focal length comes from. So just one more time to show you here. If I look inside the camera, if I take it off, and let's go ahead and we'll shoot a frame. We're looking at the film here. So this distance is 24 millimeters. This distance is 36 millimeters. The sprockets and everything, you know, from the top of the sprocket is 35 millimeters. And the distance between the line of the film plane to the back of the glass is 50 millimeters in this case. Now, I'm going to jump ships a little bit here and show you a digital camera. Now, it's the same principle, basically, and we have this is a full frame digital camera. And the reason we call it a full frame camera is because it has a sensor inside it. You can see the sensor. And this particular camera has a sensor that is the exact same size as a 35 millimeter roll of film. It's 24 millimeters by 36 millimeters. That's a full frame sensor. That will make my 50 millimeter lens on a film camera look exactly like a 50 millimeter lens on a digital camera. And it's the most expensive part of the camera. The sensor is the most expensive part. So the bigger the sensor, the more expensive the camera. So a lot of times companies will make a cropped sensor to try to make a less expensive camera. And then you have to deal with something related to crop factor, but that's an explanation for another video. But you can see on this camera that it's got a long lens on it, and the back of the glass of this camera is actually quite deep inside there. You can see the glass, it goes all the way. It's not right there at the edge. It's actually inside the lens a little bit. It's probably about, it's about that far. I don't want to stick my finger on the lens, but it's about that far. So the distance between, this camera also has the line. There's that line I was talking about. That represents the film plane. And the distance from the film plane, or the sensor plane in this case, from here to the back of the lens, suddenly that distance is 200 millimeters. It's probably like, I actually have to zoom it out to get to. So this one has a variable lens in the back because it's a zoom lens. So if I put it at 200 millimeters, then the lens that has probably gone to right here. And this distance between here and here, I don't actually know how big 200 millimeters is, but it's something like that. 50 millimeters, 200 millimeters. That's the focal length. So now what does this mean? Now we've got these different focal length names. What's the difference between a 20 millimeter, 50 millimeter, 100 millimeter, 200 millimeter, 1,000 millimeter? What's the difference between these focal lengths? Well, they determine what kind of field of view we have. And the best way to imagine it is to think of a paper towel or a toilet paper roll. you have your basic toilet paper roll here. And if you imagine this to be like a lens, and let's say this one's a 200 millimeter lens, a zoom lens, a telephoto lens, not a zoom lens, a telephoto lens. If we imagine this to be a telephoto lens and we put this on our eye, I can see just the frame of my camera here. It barely fits in. I can actually only see this much. And that would be like 200 millimeters or something similar. If I take it here and let's say I turn it into let's call that 100 and we'll call this a 50. If I cut this off and turn this into a 50 and I put this on my eye, I can basically like keep both my eyes open and I can see much further field of view. I can almost see like how far the human eye can see. I can see that the human eye is actually a little bit wider. I can't see that much on this side, but it's essentially like this would be a 50 millimeter lens. I can see much more of the field of vision. If I were to take this and let's say cut it down to 20 millimeters, which is less than half, then I'm down to, I had 200. This would be like 100. This would be like, well, we had 50. Let's see, we had 50. And now we've got like 28. We've got a little tiny one, a 28 millimeter lens or a 20 millimeter lens. When I put this lens on my eye, I can see almost everything. This is a wide lens or an ultra wide lens. This would be. So 100, 200 millimeter lens is like a telephoto lens. It puts everything in the frame like this. And a 28 or a 20 or a 15 millimeter lens opens the frame wide, so you can have a wide perspective. So that's basically the difference between focal length and film size. We did our best. I hope you enjoyed. I hope that clarified some things for you. If you got value from this, please like and subscribe. If you're keen to know more about maybe some of the basic photography elements about aperture, shutter speed, I'm always keen to, help people and teach people what I know, whether it be, actually working with the camera or working with the subjects or working inside a studio or with light or using any of the programs, Photoshop, Lightroom, and so on. Hit me up, leave me a comment and tell me if you'd like to see more photography related videos, and I'd be happy to make them. Okay, thank you for indulging me for another video. I appreciate it. This was photography focused, but more records and style coming soon. Until next time, I'll see you guys at the record store. Bye.